Hey everyone, welcome to my channel where the strange, the unexplained, and the downright creepy come to life. From real-life encounters with the paranormal to bizarre, true stories that'll keep you up at night, I bring you the eerie tales you won't hear anywhere else. If you're into late-night chills, mysterious happenings, and things that go bump in the night, you're in the right place. Subscribe, buckle up, and let's dive into the unknown. Each night, as darkness crept across the borrowed farmstead, I'd find myself pressed against the living room window, watching the cornfield with eyes burning from exhaustion and dread. The scarecrow was coming again. I could feel it in my bones, like how some folks can sense a storm rolling in. My name's Marcus, and 3 weeks ago, I thought I'd stumbled into paradise. My college buddy Jake had offered me his family's old farm to house sit for the summer. The place sat 40 minutes outside town, surrounded on all sides by endless cornfields that whispered secrets to the wind. Jake had told me his grandfather had worked that land for decades before passing away last winter, leaving behind a property that needed watching until the family figured out what to do with it. The farmhouse was simple but comfortable, white clapboard siding weathered to a soft gray, a wraparound porch with boards that creaked, and windows that rattled when trucks sped down the distant highway. A massive kitchen dominated the back of the house, complete with an ancient refrigerator that wheezed and hummed like a dying man. The cornfields stretched in every direction beyond the backyard, 7 feet tall and so dense they seemed to swallow sound. During the quick handover tour, Jake had pointed out a distant figure planted deep among the stalks. "That's the scarecrow," he said offhandedly. Even in daylight, something about it set my teeth on edge. Its face was wrapped in yellowed cloth, its body stuffed with straw poking through torn, faded overalls. Crude wooden arms reached skyward, like a crucified prisoner straining against invisible bonds. That first night, I barely thought about it. I settled onto the couch, cracked open a beer, and watched old movies on my laptop until I nodded off. Sleep came easily in the countryside silence. The first sign that something was wrong came with morning coffee. I shuffled into the kitchen in my boxers, bleary-eyed and desperate for caffeine, and froze. Muddy footprints trailed from the back door to the refrigerator. Not ordinary mud, but thick, black earth streaked with decomposing plant matter. The prints were vaguely human, but wrong. Too long. Too narrow. Each toe dug deep into the linoleum in a way that no human foot should. My first thought was Jake. Maybe he'd come by to grab something. But why would he track mud through his grandmother's spotless kitchen? I called him. He sounded genuinely confused and told me he was 3 states away visiting family. When I mentioned the footprints, he laughed nervously and said maybe I'd sleepwalked. But I knew my feet, and those weren't mine. I spent the day scrubbing the kitchen floor, hands raw, the bleach stinging my nostrils. Even once the mud was gone, the feeling lingered, that something had violated the house while I'd slept, unaware. That night it got worse. I woke to the soft hum of the refrigerator and saw its door hanging open, casting pale light across the kitchen tiles like a ghostly beacon. My heart thudded against my ribs as I crept down the hall, barefoot and silent. The fridge groaned louder, struggling to cool the escaping air. Inside, between a carton of milk and a box of leftover pizza, lay dozens of corn kernels. Some still clung to fragments of husk. They hadn't been there earlier. I was sure of it. They looked fresh, wet, almost, and when I touched one, my fingertip came away slick with some sticky film I couldn't identify. I didn't sleep after that. I paced the house until sunrise, checking and rechecking every door and window. All locked. No signs of forced entry. No broken glass. No disturbed locks. And yet, something had been inside. The corn kernels kept showing up. Every night. Sometimes in the fridge, sometimes scattered across the counter like offerings from an unseen visitor. I began staying awake, watching both the kitchen and the cornfield from the back windows. That's when I saw it move. The scarecrow stood right where Jake had said, about 100 yards from the house. In daylight, it looked like any old farm decoration. But on the 4th night, under a star-strewn sky, its silhouette shifted. At first, it was subtle, a tilt of the head, a change in posture. I thought maybe it was the moonlight playing tricks. I pressed my face against the glass, breath fogging the pain, straining to see. Then it stepped forward. The movement was deliberate, fluid, impossible for something made of straw. One moment it was among the stalks. The next it stood 3 feet closer. My throat closed up. Couldn't breathe. I fumbled for the flashlight on the kitchen counter, my hands shaking so hard I nearly dropped it. I flicked it on and swept the beam through the field. Corn swayed gently, but the scarecrow was gone. My legs gave out, and I slid down the kitchen wall, flashlight clutched to my chest. The rational part of my brain screamed that it wasn't real, that I was exhausted, isolated, unraveling. But deep down I knew better. The scarecrow was coming again tonight, and I didn't know if I'd survive it. Combining exhaustion and fear began to create hallucinations, but my body knew better. Every nerve screamed that something predatory lurked just beyond the reach of light, watching and waiting. I didn't sleep that night, or the next. Instead, I maintained a silent vigil by the window, flashlight clenched in a trembling hand, eyes raw from hours of staring into the dark. The scarecrow remained motionless during those long hours of observation. But each morning brought fresh proof that something had entered the house. Muddy footprints, scattered corn kernels, and then something worse. On the 6th morning, I noticed tiny green shoots pushing up through cracks in the kitchen tile grout. By afternoon, more had sprouted near the baseboards in the living room. The next day, a whole cluster had forced its way through the bathroom threshold. They looked like corn seedlings, fragile, pale, unmistakably alive. There was something deeply wrong about plants growing inside the house. It struck a primal chord of revulsion, as if the house itself were being digested. This wasn't vandalism. This was colonization. Something was transforming the farmhouse, blurring the boundary between cultivated land and human space. I tore the seedlings out, fists full of damp green. I stayed up pulling them one by one, only to find twice as many the next morning. They grew with unnatural speed. Some reached 2 inches overnight, despite having no soil, no sunlight. I tried sealing the baseboards, filling cracks with caulk and steel wool. But it didn't matter. New sprouts appeared elsewhere, thriving in the dark as though the house itself had become fertile ground. Sleep deprivation started to dismantle me. My hands trembled constantly, and my vision blurred at the edges. I had to focus just to make coffee or check my phone. I began talking to myself, long, looping conversations with empty rooms, just to hear any human voice, even my own. But I couldn't leave. Not yet. Something held me there. Not fear. Fascination. I needed to know what it wanted, what it was trying to say with its kernels and roots and midnight trespasses. The revelation came on the 10th night. I was hidden in the darkened living room, flashlight off, crouched behind the curtains. The moon was a swollen yolk hanging low over the cornfield, casting everything in amber and shadow. At first, nothing moved. For hours, the only motion came from the breeze through the stalks. Then, it emerged. It stepped out of the cornfield with purpose, no longer shambling, but moving in a measured, ritualistic way. The cloth-wrapped face was angled toward the house as it approached. Though I couldn't see features beneath that yellowed fabric, I felt its gaze, like pressure pressing on my lungs. My hand found the flashlight switch, but I didn't flip it. Every other time I'd shone light at it, it vanished. But tonight felt different. Tonight it wanted to be seen. The scarecrow reached the porch steps and climbed, each footfall sending a dull vibration through the floor. I bit my knuckle hard to keep from screaming, tasting blood. The rational voice in my head had gone silent, drowned in a tidal wave of animal fear. It stopped directly outside the living room window. Only glass and a few feet separated us. Up close, I saw dark stains on the wrapping around its face. Dirt or something worse. Straw protruded through its tattered clothing. And beneath the fabric, where arms and legs should have been, I saw pale root-like tendrils twitching and shifting. We stared at each other, predator and prey. My lungs burned, but I dared not exhale. It raised one arm, or what passed for an arm, and pressed it against the windowpane. The limb spread like water, branching into vine-like patterns across the glass. Then it spoke. Not with sound, not through the glass. Its voice vibrated through the floor, the walls, the bones of the house, deep and resonant, like a prayer mumbled underground. It told me of the grandfather, Jake's grandfather, who had worked this land, of a bargain struck during the worst drought the county had ever known, of a price paid for green fields and harvests that never failed, and of the inheritance tied to borrowed land. It explained the kernels, the seedlings, the footsteps, all preparations for a transformation long postponed, but never cancelled. I understood then. I hadn't been house-sitting. I'd been planted, cultivated. Like any other crop, the scarecrow hadn't come to hunt me. It had come to harvest me. But knowing the truth didn't mean I accepted it. When its appendage began slipping through invisible cracks around the window frame, I snapped. I ran. I tore through the house, grabbed my car keys from the counter, and threw open the front door. The air outside was thick and hot, smelling of soil and rot. My car roared to life on the second try. I reversed out onto the gravel drive, headlights flaring into the dark. In the rearview mirror, the scarecrow stood motionless on the porch once more, watching, waiting, patient as soil. I drove until dawn. Now I sit in a booth at a truck stop off the interstate, scribbling all this onto napkins with a pen borrowed from the cashier. My hands have finally stopped shaking, but I flinch at every sound. The rational world feels thin now, like paper stretched too tight over something pulsing underneath. And I know it's not over. Not really. Not while the seed has taken root. The fluorescent lights hummed their sickly tune in the basement corridor of St. Mary's General Hospital, casting an intermittent greenish pallor over everything they touched. It was past 3 o'clock in the morning, and the building had settled into that peculiar silence that only comes during the graveyard shift. Not quite empty, but hollow enough that every sound echoed with unnatural clarity. I'd been working night shifts in the laundry department for 6 months now, ever since my divorce left me needing the extra pay differential. The basement levels were always understaffed after midnight, leaving me alone with industrial washers, mountains of soiled linens, and the constant background symphony of mechanical breathing from the building's ventilation system. Most nights, I could lose myself in the routine, letting muscle memory guide my hands while my mind wandered elsewhere. But tonight felt different. The shadows seemed deeper, and the familiar sounds carried an edge that made the hair on my arms stand at attention. The autoclave sat silent in the corner like a metallic beast, its massive cylindrical chamber reflecting the stuttering fluorescent light in distorted waves across its polished steel surface. During the day, it roared with superheated steam, sterilizing surgical instruments and equipment with violent efficiency. Now, in the dead hours of morning, it loomed cold and motionless, yet somehow more unsettling in its dormancy. There was something about its presence that felt watchful, as if the machine retained some memory of the heat and pressure it had once contained. I was folding a stack of bed sheets beside it when the sound started. Soft at first, barely distinguishable from the building's ambient noise, the rhythmic scraping of rubber on linoleum, slow and deliberate. Chinellos, I thought absently, recognizing the distinctive shuffle of hospital slippers dragging across the floor. Probably someone walking the halls above me, a patient unable to sleep, pacing the corridors as so many did during those restless hours. My hands continued their mechanical work, smoothing wrinkles from white cotton, stacking the finished sheets in neat piles. But the sound grew marginally louder. Closer, somehow, though logic told me it had to be coming from the floor above. The building's acoustics were strange down here, sound carrying through ventilation ducts and pipes in ways that defied spatial reasoning. I had learned not to question the phantom footsteps and distant conversations that sometimes seemed to emerge from the walls themselves. Then the rhythm changed. The leisurely shuffle became more urgent, the intervals between steps shortening. Someone was walking faster now, their slippers slapping against the floor with increasing tempo. My hands slowed unconsciously, folding sheets in a rhythm that matched the escalating pace. The sound grew clearer, more distinct, and with growing unease, I realized it wasn't coming from above. It was coming from much closer. I straightened slowly, a half-folded sheet clutched in my trembling hands. The fluorescent light overhead flickered twice, casting my shadow in erratic bursts across the floor. The sound continued to build, the soft scrape of rubber now punctuated by sharp slaps of heels striking linoleum with violent force. It was coming from the corridor just beyond the laundry room's open doorway. My throat tightened as I strained to listen. There was something wrong with the pattern, something that made my nervous system recoil even as my rational mind scrambled to make sense of it. The footsteps were too fast now, inhuman in their speed, a frantic staccato no person could maintain. And beneath the main rhythm, I could hear an emerging metallic quality, as if the slippers were transforming into something harder, something worse. The room seemed to drop several degrees, though the heating system continued its steady hum. Goosebumps rose across my arms. My heartbeat thundered against my ribs. Every instinct in me screamed, "Move, get out." But my legs felt rooted in place, paralyzed, as if whatever was coming had already decided I wouldn't leave. The footsteps came closer, louder, hammering now like blows against an anvil, rhythmic and relentless, reverberating off the basement walls with a resonance that buzzed in my bones. My mouth was dry, my tongue stuck to the roof of it. The sheet in my hands was damp with sweat. I stared down and saw the dark stains my palms had left on the white cotton. Then, without warning, the sound stopped. The silence that followed was somehow worse than the noise had been. It pressed against my eardrums like water, heavy, suffocating. I could hear my own breathing, shallow and rapid, and the thunderous beating of my heart seemed loud enough to echo through the entire basement. The fluorescent light continued its intermittent flickering, creating a strobe effect that made everything appear to move in fragmented, jerky motions. I forced my feet to move one step backward toward the far wall, then another. The sheet fell from my numb fingers and drifted to the floor like a white flag of surrender. My eyes remained fixed on the doorway, watching for any sign of movement in the corridor beyond. The darkness out there seemed absolute, a black void that the weak light from the laundry room couldn't penetrate. Something was out there. I knew it with the same primal certainty that had kept my ancestors alive in primordial forests. Something that had been wearing slippers, moving through the hospital corridors with purpose and malevolent intent. Something that was now standing just beyond the reach of light, waiting. My back pressed against the wall beside the autoclave. The cold steel surface shocked my skin even through the thickness of my uniform shirt. The machine's polished exterior reflected the room in warped, funhouse distortions, and as I glanced at it, my blood turned to ice in my veins. In the curved reflection of the autoclave's surface, I could see the corridor behind me, the one I was facing, stretched and distorted but still recognizable. The doorway was there, the weak fluorescent light spilling out into the darkness. But I wasn't in the reflection. The image showed an empty laundry room, sheets scattered on the floor where I had dropped them, but no trace of me. No shadow, no presence, nothing. And in the reflected corridor, something else was visible. A figure stood motionless in the dark, just beyond the doorway. Its posture was all wrong, impossible. The spine twisted at angles that should have broken it. Limbs bent in directions that defied anatomy. But what made my vision blur with terror was the name badge pinned to its chest. The same blue and white hospital ID I wore every day, complete with my photograph and identification number. I spun around, expecting to see it standing right behind me, but the hallway was empty. My legs nearly gave out beneath me as I turned back to the autoclave. The reflection hadn't changed. The twisted figure was still there in the mirror-world hallway, standing utterly still, wearing my credentials, occupying a space my eyes told me was vacant. Panic flooded my body like molten metal, every nerve screaming at once. I staggered away from the wall, my coordination shot, legs wobbling beneath me. The overhead light chose that moment to flicker violently again, the room strobing between light and shadow like a nightmare discotheque. In the flashes of darkness, I saw movement in my periphery. Shapes that shouldn't exist, shadows that didn't belong to anything. Shadows that moved independently of their sources. I ran. My feet slammed against the linoleum as I bolted into the corridor, lungs burning as I fought for air. Behind me, the sound returned, Those same terrible metallic footfalls, faster now, pursuing me. The hallway lights flickered in a chain reaction as I passed beneath them, one after another, like my presence was triggering some electrical disturbance, or like something else was following me, leaving blackness in its wake. The stairwell was at the far end of the basement, past the morgue and through a warren of service corridors I'd walked 100 times before. But now the route seemed endless, stretched and surreal, like the hallway had been painted by a madman. My ID badge bounced against my chest as I ran, the plastic card feeling far heavier than it should have, as if it was trying to drag me down. The footsteps behind me kept pace, metallic and violent, echoing off the concrete walls with a horrible resonance that came from every direction at once. I dared a glance over my shoulder, nothing, empty corridor. But the noise kept building, louder, faster, more chaotic. By the time I reached the stairwell, my lungs were on fire, and my vision had begun to narrow into a suffocating tunnel. I grabbed the metal handrail and dragged myself upward, taking the stairs 3 at a time. The sound of my own feet merged with the phantom noise below, each step punctuated by the relentless pursuit. The emergency lights in the stairwell cast harsh shadows on the concrete walls. My own silhouette twisted and stretched as I climbed, the angles growing sharper, less human. At the main floor landing, I fumbled with my key card, my hands shaking so badly I could barely swipe it. The electronic lock beeped twice, then disengaged. I shoved through the door into the main corridor, and the sounds of the night shift hit me like a wave of grace. Distant monitors beeping, the soft hum of elevators, quiet voices at the nurses' stations. Normal sounds, human sounds. I collapsed against the wall, gasping for breath, my entire body trembling with exhaustion and fear. The hospital's usual nighttime eeriness now felt like a warm blanket, comforting in its banality. There were people nearby, real people, nurses, techs, staff. Their presence alone was enough to begin knitting the edges of my shattered nerves. But just as my breathing started to steady, something new caught my attention, something that sent my heart racing once more. My ID badge was gone. The lanyard still hung around my neck, but the plastic card, the one with my photo and credentials, was missing. I must have lost it during my frantic escape, though I couldn't remember feeling it tear away. But even as I told myself that, the implications landed like a hammer blow. Because if I wasn't wearing it anymore, then what was? Some places on Earth shouldn't exist. The Black Rock Plateau was one of them, a geological impossibility rising from the Nevada desert like a monument to something ancient and wrong. I'd spent over 20 years in the field, documenting tectonic anomalies, lava tubes, meteorite craters, but this wasn't in any textbook. 300 feet of pure obsidian, smooth as glass, with no sign of volcanic origin. No ash deposits, no pyroclastic residue, not even the heat scarring you'd expect. It just existed, as if it had been carved from the Earth's nightmares and left to bake under the desert sun. I'd been camped alone on the summit for 3 days, trying to make sense of the impossible. I took readings, filled notebooks with measurements that refused to align with any known science, and tried to ignore the silence. Not the quiet of an isolated location, but a silence so complete it pressed in on me. No wind, no insects, no rustle of desert brush below. Just the scrape of my pencil and the sound of my own breathing, loud in the stillness. When the voice came, it struck like a physical blow. I was hunched over my spectrometer at 2:47 a.m., adjusting the settings for another mineral scan. When I heard it, a whisper, drifting up from the black void beyond the plateau's edge. My name. Not Dr. Harrison. Not Professor. Not even Jake, which is what most people called me. No, this was my full name, the one buried in birth certificates and government paperwork, the one I hadn't spoken aloud since I was a child. The voice was female, melodic, with an accent I couldn't place. It rose from hundreds of feet below, floating up through solid air and stone. Researcher. Oh, researcher. I froze, my hands still on the equipment. The hair on the back of my neck stood upright. I told myself it was some fluke of desert acoustics, wind funneling through crevices, bouncing off canyon walls in strange ways. perfectly rational. But there was no wind, not even a breeze to stir the dust. The night was dead calm. Researcher. Closer this time, as if whoever it was had climbed through the rock itself. My heart pounded so hard I could feel the pulse in my throat. Sweat prickled on my forehead despite the cool air. My first instinct was to stay still, wait for dawn. But the other instinct, the one drilled into me by 2 decades of scientific inquiry, demanded that I investigate. I grabbed my flashlight, a military-grade torch capable of cutting through a quarter-mile of darkness, and stepped away from the safety of the lantern's pool of light. The edge of the plateau was maybe 50 feet ahead, a black void marked by the absence of stars. Each step felt heavier than the last, as though gravity were thickening around me. My breath came in shallow gasps. My mouth was dry as bone. I kept sweeping the flashlight side to side, scanning the rock face for movement, for a trick of light, for any shape that didn't belong. The voice spoke again. This time it came from just beyond the edge. Not a whisper, a murmur. Presence. Come see, it said. Come understand. I stopped walking. My flashlight trembled in my grip, casting wild arcs across the obsidian. And then something moved just out of range. Something too tall, too narrow, with proportions that made my brain stutter. I backed away. Fast. Didn't stop until I was in the tent, zipper shut, flashlight clutched like a weapon. I didn't sleep. Didn't take any more measurements. At sunrise, I packed up and left the plateau without a word. I never published my findings. Never requested another grant. But sometimes, when sleep is far and the night is too quiet, I hear it again. Not in the desert, but in the silence between thoughts. My name, that voice, and the promise that whatever waits in the stone is still listening. I approached the edge of the plateau with my flashlight, the beam cutting through nothing but black obsidian and yawning emptiness. Far below, the desert floor vanished into ink-dark shadows, broken only by the twisted silhouettes of distant Joshua trees. Gaunt, lifeless sentinels against the void. Researcher, come down to us. The voice came from directly below me now. I leaned out, angling the flashlight along the vertical cliff face. The obsidian was flawless, slick, seamless, without a single handhold or ledge where someone might hide. Yet the voice was unmistakably rising from somewhere beneath. My hands trembled as I adjusted the focus, trying to push the beam deeper into the gulf. Then it caught something, a shift in color, maybe 30 feet down. Not natural. Too sharp. Too exact. I dropped to my stomach, heart hammering, and crawled forward until my head crept past the edge. The sheer drop made my vision real. My inner ear screamed warnings, but I kept looking. There, a rectangular patch of stone that didn't belong. Not a shadow. Not erosion. It was precise. Deliberate. A door carved straight into the obsidian. Come down, the voice urged. We're waiting. It was coming from that opening. From inside it. My brain staggered. There were no caves in obsidian. No known natural process could have hollowed a chamber inside such a material. And even if there were, how could anyone be down there? The cliff face was smooth, vertical, unscalable. I scrambled backward, blood thundering in my ears. My campsite looked pathetic now. The gear, the lantern, even the sleeping bag. Flimsy, ridiculous defenses against whatever was speaking to me from that impossible hollow in the stone. The darkness outside the circle of light felt alive. Watching. Breathing. Sleep was a laughable concept. I spent the rest of the night pacing the perimeter of my camp. Flashlight clutched tightly, beam sweeping from edge to edge, again and again. The voices stopped sometime after 3 a.m., but their absence was worse than their presence. The silence pressed against my eardrums like deep ocean pressure, so dense I wanted to scream just to relieve it. By the time the sky in the east began to pale, I had already packed most of my gear. Whatever lay beneath this place, it could wait for better tools, a full expedition team. People, not just one man alone in the dark. Then, just as I bent to roll my sleeping bag, something glinted. Near the plateau's center, maybe 200 yards from camp. A gleam across the obsidian I knew hadn't been there before. I'd surveyed that entire area yesterday. photographed every crack and ripple. That surface had been uniform, but now there was a fissure, a thin, deep slit running 10 feet north to south. Steam curled from its depths, bringing with it a sulfuric stench that hit my nose like a slap. I knelt beside it, dread curdling in my gut even as professional instinct forced me closer. The steam was far too hot, hotter than any natural geothermal vent I'd ever studied. When I held my hand above the crack, it felt like standing in front of a blast furnace. And then, beneath the hiss, a new sound. Not water, not gas, voices, rhythmic, repetitive, chanting. I pulled out my phone, turned on the flashlight, and angled it into the fissure. The beam revealed rough obsidian walls, until 20 feet down the texture changed. The surface smoothed, became uniform, artificial. I repositioned the light. Something shimmered on the wall. Symbols, maybe, or writing. I strained to see, blinking through the heat. Then I froze. There, carved cleanly into the obsidian, was my name. Dr. Jacob Nathaniel Harrison. Full. Unmistakable. A name I hadn't spoken aloud in years, known only to the bureaucracy of academic paperwork. Below it, more text. Couldn't make it out. The steam was too thick. I lurched backward so fast I slipped, hitting the ground hard. My phone skittered across the rock, its flashlight spinning wild arcs before coming to rest against a boulder. My rational mind flailed, shouting hallucination, pareidolia, sleep deprivation. But no delusion could etch such precise, new marks into stone. I crawled back on raw palms, ignoring the burn of hot obsidian beneath my skin. The steam was denser now, rising in choking clouds, but I could still see it, my name in impossible stone. And the voices no longer faint, no longer singular, multiple now, harmonized, female, chanting, calling me. I'd heard the chanting echo faintly through the rising steam, voices blending together, speaking in unison, though the words remained indecipherable. As I stared in horror and fascination, water began to seep from the carved letters. Not clear condensation like steam, but a thick, dark liquid, sliding down the fissure walls in slow, deliberate rivulets. It smelled metallic, like old blood, and the boiling heat made steam rise from it, yet it flowed purposefully, tracing channels I hadn't noticed before. Those channels formed intricate patterns, symbols that writhed and shifted whenever I looked directly at them, as if alive in my peripheral vision. My breaths came fast and sharp. The air felt wrong, too thick, too warm, heavy with sulfur and something rotten, something organic. Panic surged through me. I wanted to flee, to gather my gear and escape this cursed plateau, but my legs betrayed me. I was frozen, kneeling beside that impossible fissure, watching boiling liquid sketch ancient designs older than human civilization. The chanting crescendoed. The liquid's flow quickened, pouring steadily from my carved name now. A stream of superheated fluid that should have evaporated instantly in the dry desert air, but instead slipped into the channels below. The pool at the bottom began to glow with a sickly, phosphorescent light that made my skin crawl. In that eerie glow, I saw something that shattered the last remnants of my rationality. Dozens of names, carved into every inch of the fissure's walls. Dr. Patricia Vance, who vanished on a survey in Utah 3 years ago. Professor Michael Chun, missing from an Arizona dig site. Dr. Sarah Whitmore, whose abandoned campsite was found in the Mojave with no trace of her. All geologists, all researchers, all devoted to unraveling the Earth's secrets, and all gone. Then the chanting stopped, abruptly, leaving only the hiss and bubble of the boiling liquid. In the sudden silence, I heard footsteps, slow, deliberate, approaching from behind. Impossible on this isolated, sheer plateau. I spun around, still on my knees, expecting to see someone emerge from the empty black obsidian expanse. But there was nothing, just my abandoned equipment, my hastily rolled sleeping bag, and the vast dome of pale morning sky. The footsteps circled me, scraping against the stone, their echo ringing clear. But I saw no disturbance in the dust, no shadow cast by the rising sun. Panic flooded me like ice water. My heart hammered so hard I thought it might burst. Sweat mixed with tears I didn't remember shedding as I fumbled for my phone, desperate to call for help, to reach the outside world. But there was no signal, the plateau was too remote, too isolated. I was utterly alone, trapped with whatever was stalking me. The footsteps stopped directly behind me. I could feel the presence, solid, real, though I saw nothing. Heat radiated from my back, different from the geothermal warmth rising from the fissure. This was body heat, human warmth. Breath brushed the back of my neck, slow, steady exhalations carrying the scent of stone and sulfur. "Welcome, researcher." The voice was female, melodic, perfectly enunciated despite the impossible circumstances. It was behind me, beside me, inside my head. I tried to turn, but my body locked up completely. Every muscle rigid, every nerve screaming. "We've been waiting for you, preparing your place." I forced my eyes down into the fissure. The boiling liquid was rising, filling the channels carved around my name. The phosphorescent glow pulsed like a heartbeat, and in that rhythm, I heard something that froze my blood. My own heartbeat, perfectly synchronized. "The earth keeps its secrets, Jacob," the voice whispered. "But it also keeps its guardians. And every guardian needs their researcher." Understanding crashed over me like a physical blow. The missing geologists, the carved names, the impossible obsidian plateau itself, this wasn't natural. It was a trap, a collection point designed to lure people like me, people who dedicated their lives to probing the Earth's mysteries. "You can fight if you wish." They all did. But the stone remembers everything. Jacob, every footstep, every breath, every heartbeat. "You're already part of it." I looked down at my hands pressed against the obsidian surface. My palms had left clear impressions in the impossibly hard rock. The marks left in the stone weren't mere burns from heat. They were actual indentations, as though the obsidian itself was softening and yielding beneath the pressure of my hands. I stared in disbelief and growing horror as the impressions deepened, my palms sinking slowly into what should have been hard, unyielding rock. The rational part of my mind, everything I clung to for safety and sanity, shattered utterly in that moment. I lurched to my feet, a cold panic rising inside me like a physical force. My breath came fast and ragged, every instinct screaming at me to flee. I abandoned my equipment, my painstakingly collected research, everything, except the desperate, overwhelming need to escape. My legs, as if fueled by pure terror, propelled me forward across the plateau's unforgiving surface. Behind me, laughter echoed. It wasn't cruel or mocking, but calm, amused, almost indulgent, like an elder watching a child stumble in confusion. The sound carried across the empty space, blending with the faint hiss of the boiling liquid, still tracing its unnatural patterns in the fissure. Without pausing to think, I reached the edge of the plateau where I'd anchored my climbing rope. I didn't check my gear. I ignored all protocols drilled into me during years of fieldwork. I rappelled down the sheer cliff face as fast as I could, heart hammering in my chest. The desert floor rushed up to meet me with bone-jarring force. I hit the ground running, stumbling through clumps of sagebrush and leaping over scattered rock formations, every muscle screaming in protest. My truck was parked 2 miles away. 2 miles I covered in 20 torturous minutes, lungs burning and legs trembling with exhaustion. When I finally reached the vehicle, my hands shook uncontrollably. The keys slipped from my grasp 3 times before I managed to start the engine. As I sped away, I made a fatal mistake. I glanced back in the rearview mirror. There, rising stark and black against the pale morning sky, was the plateau, like a jagged finger thrusting upward toward the heavens. At its summit, I saw them, figures moving, small but unmistakably human. They stood at the edge, watching me retreat with eerie calm. One of them raised a hand and waved. My heart slammed against my ribs as I pushed the accelerator harder, racing through the desert. The radio crackled with static, my cell phone dead weight in my pocket, completely without signal. The miles stretched between me and the plateau, but the distance felt meaningless. In my mind, the chanting echoed still. I could still see my name, carved deeply into that impossible, shifting stone. And in the depths of my fear and confusion, a terrible truth began to take root. The earth does keep its secrets, ancient and vast, but it also marks those who pry too deeply, those who try too hard to unravel what should remain hidden. I have been marked now. I know, with the absolute certainty of the stone beneath my fingertips and the sulfur-tainted air that filled my lungs, that someday I will return to that plateau, not by choice, but by compulsion. Like iron filings drawn irresistibly to a magnet, I will be pulled back, drawn into the dark heart of that ancient place. Because the stone remembers everything. Every footstep, every breath, every heartbeat. And it never lets go. The sound of Mrs. Adelia's voice made my skin crawl, setting off a primal alarm deep in my brain that recognized pure danger in those foreign syllables, though I couldn't begin to understand why. It was as if some ancient part of me knew the chant was wrong, that it carried a warning. The building itself seemed to react to her midnight rituals. During those episodes, the old radiators would clank and groan with unusual intensity, despite the mild October night outside. The fluorescent lights above flickered more aggressively, casting jittery shadows that danced unnaturally across the peeling walls. Most unsettling were the footsteps, faint but distinct, echoing in the empty corridors, even though I was the only staff member on duty. About 3 weeks into the job, while making my medication rounds, I heard Mrs. Adelia's voice begin its familiar chant. But something was different that night. The usual hypnotic rhythm was gone, replaced by a harsh urgency, a desperate cadence that made my teeth ache. The sound rose and fell with wild, uneven patterns that felt like a physical assault on my senses. Without thinking, I found myself drawn down the long hallway toward room 247. It was as if the sound itself pulled me forward before I had consciously decided to move. The corridor stretched longer than usual, the overhead lights flickering violently with each step, creating a strobe effect that made the cracked and peeling paint on the walls seem alive, writhing and shifting in the intermittent glow. My heartbeat thundered in my ears, drowning out everything else, and a cold sweat formed at my hairline despite the building's constant chill. When I reached her door, I stopped short. Mrs. Adelia was no longer seated upright in her bed. Instead, she stood beside it, facing the window that overlooked the facility's overgrown garden. Her hospital gown hung loosely on her skeletal frame, and her white hair, usually pinned neatly, spilled wild and untamed around her shoulders. The sounds emerging from her throat had changed again, now lower, guttural, coming from somewhere deeper than her vocal cords should allow, resonating with a terrifying unnaturalness. The air in the room felt thick, almost viscous, making each breath a conscious, laborious effort. Every instinct screamed at me to turn and run, to retreat back to the nurse's station and wait for morning. But instead, I stepped inside. The moment my foot crossed the threshold, Mrs. Adelia's chanting stopped abruptly. The sudden silence was far more terrifying than the terrible noise that had preceded it. She stood perfectly still for what felt like an eternity, though it was probably only seconds. Then she slowly turned to face me. Her eyes, they were completely black. Not just her pupils, but the entire visible surface of her eyes had turned into a solid, reflective void that swallowed the flickering light from the hallway. When she looked at me, I felt an alien coldness sweep across my mind, like icy fingers probing inside my skull, searching and invading my thoughts. My mouth went dry. My hands trembled so violently that the clipboard I'd been holding slipped from my grip and clattered loudly to the floor. The sound echoed unbearably in the suffocating stillness. Mrs. Adelia tilted her head at an impossible angle, nearly 90 degrees to the left, and began to walk toward me. Her movements were fluid and predatory, a terrifying contrast to the shuffling gait I had seen during my previous encounters with her. Each step seemed to resonate through the old floorboards. I could feel the vibrations travel up my legs as if the building itself was warning me. I wanted to run. Every nerve, every cell screamed at me to flee, but my legs refused to obey. I was frozen in place, rooted to the spot as she drew nearer, those impossible black eyes growing larger and darker with every step. My breathing quickened, becoming shallow and ragged. I could taste copper in my mouth, an unmistakable sign I had bitten my tongue without noticing. When she was close enough that I could feel the unnatural chill radiating from her skin, Mrs. Adelia reached out and grasped my wrist with her right hand. Her fingers, which I'd thought fragile and brittle, now clamped down with crushing force. I could feel my bones grinding beneath the pressure. A sound escaped my throat, part gasp, part whimper. The moment her skin touched mine, the room around us began to change. The beige walls darkened, not from shadows, but as if some inky black substance was seeping through the paint itself. The darkness spread outward from where we stood, creeping along the surfaces like spilled ink, devouring everything in its path. But it was the floor that truly terrified me. Beneath our feet, the old hardwood groaned with deep, resonant sounds I'd never heard before, noises that seemed to come from the very core of the building. The boards warped and buckled, bending unnaturally beneath us. And then I saw them. Long, deep gouges appeared in the wood around us, as if claws had carved themselves into the floor in real time. Invisible talons dragged through the timber with such force that splinters flew in all directions. The scratches formed a perfect circle around Mrs. Adelia and me, each mark precisely spaced and uniformly deep, as though sealing us inside some ancient, terrible ritual. The sound of wood being torn filled the air, blending with Mrs. Adelia's resumed chanting to create a symphony of wrongness that made my entire body tremble with terror. I tried to pull away, but her grip held fast. Her black eyes never left mine. Behind that inky void, I saw shapes moving, intelligent but utterly alien. The cold radiating from her touch spread up my arm, numbing my shoulder and creeping toward my chest. The circle of claw marks was nearly complete. As the invisible talons carved the final scratches into the floor, connecting the pattern, the air pressure in the room shifted dramatically. My ears popped, and for a moment I heard nothing but the thunderous beating of my own heart. Then Mrs. Adelia spoke. For the first time, I understood her words. She revealed secrets about me, things no one else knew, buried fears, mistakes I'd never voiced aloud. But she didn't just know these things. She understood what they meant, how they linked to shape the pattern of my life, and most terrifyingly, what would happen if left unchanged. Her knowledge wasn't spoken. It was downloaded directly into my consciousness, bypassing my ears entirely. I realized then that Mrs. Adelia, or whatever was speaking through her, had been watching me since I started working at Sunset Manor. It had been measuring my worthiness for something I still couldn't grasp. As this impossible truth settled like acid in my mind, the scratches on the floor began to glow with a faint greenish light. The illumination pulsed in rhythm with her words. The circle wasn't just decoration, it was a boundary, a marker, a trap. The cold spread to my chest. My breathing grew labored. Ice crystals formed on my skin where she held me. I saw my breath mist in the suddenly frigid air. But the physical chill was nothing compared to the mental assault flooding my mind. Visions came, the history of Sunset Manor stretching back decades. I saw previous night shift workers like me who had encountered Mrs. Adelia during her nocturnal episodes. I watched them face the same choice I was now confronting, and the consequences of their decisions. Some had fled, abandoning their jobs forever, haunted by memories they could never explain. Others stayed, accepting the knowledge given to them, allowing themselves to be changed. Then Mrs. Adelia released my wrist. The warmth that returned felt like being dropped into a hot bath after hours in a freezer. Sensation flooded back, along with pins and needles so fierce they brought tears to my eyes. I staggered backward, finally able to move, but I was still trapped within the glowing circle. The black in her eyes faded, replaced by their usual pale blue. She looked at me with a lucidity and humanity so profound it was somehow more terrifying than the alien intelligence moments before. She smiled, a smile that acknowledged the truth between us. The charade was over. Without a word, she walked back to her bed and settled beneath the covers. Moments later, she appeared to be sleeping peacefully, just another elderly resident of Sunset Manor getting her rest. But I felt her awareness like a weight on my shoulders, a constant reminder that I was still being watched, still being evaluated. The scratches in the floor remained, their glow fading to a barely perceptible shimmer. In daylight, they looked like ordinary wear and tear, the kind of damage expected in a building this old. But I knew what they really were: a mark, a sign, a warning. I completed my rounds in numb shock, my hands shaking as I checked on residents, recorded vitals, dispensed medication. Every shadow seemed to conceal watching eyes. Every creak of the old building sounded like whispered threats. When my shift finally ended at 7 a.m., I walked to my car in a daze. The morning sun was impossibly bright after the nightmare of the night, and the normal sounds of traffic and birds felt distant, from another world entirely. I sat in the driver's seat for a long time, staring back at Sunset Manor's facade, trying to process everything. I could quit. I could drive away and never return, find another job, another life. But I knew it wouldn't solve anything. The knowledge Mrs. Adelia had shared couldn't be unlearned. The choice she'd presented couldn't be avoided forever. That evening, I returned to work. Mrs. Adelia was waiting for me in the hallway outside room 247, fully dressed and carrying a small suitcase. She nodded at me politely, as if we were old acquaintances crossing paths by chance. Then, with a quiet seriousness, she told me her family would be picking her up in the morning. Her time at Sunset Manor was coming to an end. Before she left, though, she had something important to give me. From her suitcase, she withdrew a worn leather journal, its pages filled with handwritten notes in dozens of languages. Some were familiar, others completely foreign, and a few were composed of strange symbols that hurt to look at directly. She pressed the book into my hands and told me it would help me understand the responsibilities I was inheriting. The journal was warm, almost pulsing like a heartbeat beneath my palms. Mrs. Adelia returned to her room, and I never saw her again. The next morning, I learned no family had come for her. According to the day staff, she had simply vanished overnight, leaving behind only her hospital gown and a faint smell of wet earth in her room. Official discharge papers were in perfect order, signed by doctors who claimed no memory of treating her. Her records showed exactly 1 month's stay, though I knew she'd been there longer when I started. The journal remains with me. I've read enough to understand that Sunset Manor is far more than it appears. Some buildings aren't just structures, they are anchors, holding things in place that would otherwise drift into spaces where they don't belong. The manor needs a guardian. Someone to watch the boundaries, to keep the crossing points stable. That someone is now me. I still work the night shift, checking on residents and performing my duties, but my real work begins at 1:47 a.m., when the walls grow thin and things start to stir. The journal has taught me what to watch for, what to allow, and what must be stopped before it fully manifests. Mrs. Adelia wasn't the first to serve as conduit, and she won't be the last. These special patients come and go, drawn here by forces beyond their understanding. Some know their role. Others are vessels for intelligences that speak through dreams. My hands no longer tremble when impossible languages echo through the halls. My heart no longer races when shadows move of their own accord. The cold touch of otherworldly attention has become as familiar as my own reflection. But sometimes, in the quiet hours before dawn, I wonder what I've become. The knowledge Mrs. Adelia shared has grown inside me like a living thing, changing how I see reality itself. I notice patterns others miss, understand connections that should not exist, and feel the constant presence of watchers from beyond normal perception. The scratches on the floor of room 247 have been covered by new flooring, but I know they're still there, waiting for the next guardian who will need them. When that time comes, when someone new arrives to take my place, I will be ready to pass on what I've learned. Until then, I wait, I watch, and I make sure that the things that speak through sleeping minds stay exactly where they belong. Trapped between worlds, contained within the crumbling walls of Sunset Manor, held in check by the will of those foolish enough to bear the burden. The fluorescent lights buzz overhead, casting sickly shadows across the yellowed linoleum. The scent of disinfectant and wet earth fills my nostrils with every breath. But now I understand these aren't just signs of decay or neglect. They are symptoms of something much larger, much older, and infinitely more dangerous than a failing nursing home. And I am the only thing standing between that something and the unsuspecting world beyond these walls. It was like wearing clothes that didn't quite fit, uncomfortable at first, but the unease grew stronger each day. Soon, I found myself obsessively checking locks and avoiding certain rooms after dark. The basement had been the worst from the beginning. It stretched the full length of the house, divided into several cramped rooms by crude wooden partitions that looked like afterthoughts. The ceiling was so low I had to duck in places, and the concrete floor was stained with substances I preferred not to identify. A single bulb hung from a frayed cord, casting harsh shadows that seemed to move on their own, independent of any light source. The air tasted metallic, like sucking on old pennies. My grandmother had used the basement for storage. Boxes filled with photographs, old furniture, and the accumulated detritus of 80 years of life. I'd meant to sort through it all, but something about that space made my skin crawl. Every time I descended the creaking wooden stairs, my body tensed with a primitive alarm. My breathing grew shallow, and my hands developed a fine tremor I couldn't control. It was as if some ancient part of my brain recognized a danger my conscious mind couldn't comprehend. After 2 weeks of growing unease, I finally broke down and installed a security system. Nothing fancy, just motion sensors connected to an app on my phone, with a small camera in each major room. I told myself it was practical, a way to monitor the house when I was at work. But the truth was, I needed proof that I wasn't losing my mind. The feeling of being watched had become so intense I'd started talking to myself just to break the oppressive silence. I caught myself checking over my shoulder so often my neck developed a permanent ache. The first sensor to trigger was in the living room on a Tuesday night. My phone buzzed at 2:17 a.m., jolting me awake with its harsh notification tone. The app showed movement detected, but when I pulled up the camera feed, I saw nothing but the empty living room, bathed in the pale glow of streetlights filtering through gauze curtains. I stared at the screen for 10 minutes, heart hammering against my ribs, before convincing myself it had been a false alarm. Maybe a mouse, the house settling, or the sensor's sensitivity set too high. The second trigger came from the kitchen the next night, again in the early hours when sleep was lightest and shadows held the most power. This time, I crept downstairs with a baseball bat clenched in sweating palms, every board groaning underfoot like a betrayal. But the kitchen was empty. Everything was exactly as I'd left it. The coffee maker blinking its green light, the refrigerator humming its mechanical lullaby, breakfast dishes clean in the drying rack. Nothing disturbed, nothing out of place, nothing to explain the icy certainty that something had been there just moments before. By the third false alarm, my nerves were frayed. I jumped at my own shadow. Sleep became elusive, fitful fragments between long hours lying rigid in bed, straining to hear sounds that might not exist. I began doubting the sensors, wondering if I'd bought cheap equipment that couldn't distinguish real intruders from random environmental noise. Then came the first basement alarm. The notification pierced the 3 a.m. silence like a digital scream. I bolted upright with such force I nearly fell out of bed. My phone's screen blazed in the darkness. Movement detected in the basement storage room. My hands shook so badly I struggled to navigate to the camera feed. My heart pounded, vision blurring at the edges. The basement camera showed only darkness. Not the usual shadowy dimness of a lightless room, but an absolute black void that seemed to swallow the camera's infrared illumination. I could see the concrete floor near the stairs, the bottom edges of storage boxes, but beyond that, nothing. Just an impenetrable wall of shadow. Then I heard it through the phone speaker. A sound that locked every muscle in my body with primal terror. Slow, deliberate breathing, mechanical in rhythm. Each exhale lasting exactly 3 seconds. Each inhale, too. It was too clear, too close to the microphone, as if whatever was breathing stood directly next to the camera. I listened for what felt like hours but was probably only minutes, holding my breath until my lungs burned, afraid that any noise I made might alert whatever lurked down there. The breathing continued without change, steady and inevitable like a metronome. When it finally stopped, the silence that followed was worse than the sound itself. Sleep became impossible. I spent the rest of the night in my bedroom, the baseball bat resting across my knees, checking the camera feed every few minutes. The basement remained empty, or at least it appeared so. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still down there, waiting in the spaces the camera couldn't see. The second basement alarm came the next night, exactly at 3:17 a.m. Again, the camera showed that strange light-absorbing darkness. And again, the breathing, the same measured pattern, mocking the rapid, panicked rhythm of my own. This time, I noticed something else. A faint scratching sound beneath the breathing, like fingernails dragging across concrete or metal scraping against stone. I grabbed my phone and called the police, my voice cracking as I tried to explain. The dispatcher clearly thought I was imagining things. I was either drunk or having a breakdown. They promised to send a unit to check the perimeter. But by the time the officers arrived 20 minutes later, the basement was silent. The officers were professional but skeptical. Their flashlights cut through the basement gloom as they conducted a cursory search. They found nothing, no signs of forced entry, no evidence of an intruder, no explanation for the sounds I'd heard. One officer, a tired-looking woman with gray streaks in her temples, suggested that old houses often had issues with settling foundations and small animals. She advised me to have the sensors checked by a technician and maybe consider getting a cat to deal with any mice triggering false alarms. Her partner was less diplomatic, his expression making it clear he thought I was wasting their time with paranoid delusions. After they left, I forced myself down to the basement with a powerful flashlight, determined to find some rational explanation. The concrete floor was dusty and undisturbed, the storage boxes exactly where I left them. But when I examined the motion sensor near the camera, my blood turned to ice. The device was bent, not broken or damaged, but deliberately manipulated. The plastic housing curved inward as if invisible hands had tried to reshape it. The sensor's detection field, which should have pointed outward, was instead aimed directly at the camera, as if something was trying to peer inside the device to understand how it worked or what it was watching. My hands trembled violently as I straightened it, nearly dropping the flashlight. The plastic felt warm despite the basement's chill, and when I pulled my fingers away, they felt sticky, coated with some residue I couldn't identify. The third night was worse. I barely managed to fall asleep before the alarm jolted me awake at 3:27 a.m. 10 minutes later than the previous nights, as if whatever was down there was varying its schedule to keep me off balance. This time, alongside the breathing and scratching, I heard a low humming, barely audible, vibrating through the house's wooden frame. The camera feed showed the same impenetrable darkness, but now I saw movement within it. Not clear shapes, but flickers of motion like shadows behind black curtains. The breathing grew louder, more urgent, and beneath it came a new, sickening sound. Wet sliding noises, as if something was dragging itself across the damp concrete. I grabbed the small pistol I'd bought after the second incident, feeling utterly inadequate in my shaking hands, and crept downstairs. Each step felt like betrayal, my body screaming to run while my mind demanded answers. The basement door stood slightly ajar, though I was certain I'd closed it. A cold breath of air flowed up, carrying a smell like copper and decay. The wooden stairs groaned beneath me as I descended, my flashlight beam trembling wildly. The basement appeared empty, just boxes and shadows, but the motion sensor was bent again, almost folded in half as if something had tried to crush it. The metal housing was warm beneath my palm and slick with moisture that hadn't been there before. But what I found next nearly sent me fleeing back upstairs in panic. Scratched deep into the concrete wall were marks. Crude symbols gouged so deeply they left pale concrete dust scattered below. The scratches were fresh. I would have noticed them during previous inspections. They formed a pattern that felt familiar yet refused to resolve into anything I could understand. The breathing stopped the moment my foot touched the basement floor, replaced by a silence so complete it pressed against my eardrums. But I felt watched, observed with a piercing intensity that made my skin crawl and scalp prickle with electric awareness. Something was down there with me, something perfectly still, perfectly quiet, waiting to see what I would do. I spent less than 5 minutes in the basement that night, but it had felt like hours. Every shadow seemed to pulse with potential movement. Every creak and groan of the old house made me whirl toward empty corners, gun raised and heart pounding. When I finally retreated upstairs, I locked the basement door and shoved a chair under the handle, as if thin wood and cheap hardware could keep out whatever was staking its claim in the space below. By the fourth night, I'd made a decision that felt either brilliantly courageous or utterly insane. I was going to stay awake and wait. I settled in the kitchen with a clear view of the basement door, my gun within easy reach and my phone set to record everything. If something was living in my basement, if some intruder had found a way in that I couldn't detect, I was determined to catch them in the act. The hours crawled by with agonizing slowness. I drank enough coffee to make my hands shake independently of fear, and I checked the basement camera feed so many times that my phone's battery began to drain. But as 3 a.m. approached, my nerves stretched tight like a snapped wire. The house seemed to grow heavier, more oppressive with every passing minute. Shadows deepening, silence swelling with unspoken threats. Then, at 3:37 a.m., the alarm screamed. This time I was ready. I flipped immediately to the camera feed, heart hammering but mind sharp with caffeine and adrenaline. The basement appeared empty as always, shrouded in that same light-swallowing darkness. But then I saw it: movement. Not random flickers of shadow or shifting light, but deliberate, purposeful motion, as if the absence of light itself was alive, aware. The breathing started soft but grew louder with every cycle, and beneath it came new sounds. Wet, organic noises that spoke of things that shouldn't exist, dragging themselves across cold concrete. Then I saw the sensor begin to bend. The plastic housing curved inward before my eyes, reshaping as if invisible hands were molding it like clay. The movement was slow, deliberate, almost sensual in its precision. When it was done, the sensor was pointed directly at the camera. Directly at me. Then came the impossible. I heard my own breathing through the phone speaker. Not the mechanical, measured sound that had terrified me these past 3 nights, but my own rapid, panicked respirations, transmitted somehow from my position in the kitchen, down to the basement, and back through the camera's microphone. It made no sense. Technically impossible. Improbable. Yet I was listening to myself breathe through a speaker, sitting 30 feet above the device capturing the sound. The realization hit me like a physical blow. Whatever was in my basement wasn't just aware of the cameras and sensors, it was using them. It had learned to manipulate the devices, bending them to its will, turning my security system into a two-way mirror. I hadn't been monitoring an intruder. I had been observed, studied, cataloged by something that understood technology better than I did. I ran, abandoning my post in the kitchen, fleeing to my bedroom like a child afraid of monsters in the dark. But even behind a locked door, I felt exposed, vulnerable, watched by eyes I couldn't see, through cameras I'd installed to make myself feel safe. The basement alarm continued screaming for another 10 minutes before falling silent, leaving me alone with the terrible knowledge. I was no longer the sole occupant of my grandmother's house. Now, as I sit here in the pre-dawn darkness of the 5th night, I finally understand what my grandmother's stories were trying to tell me. This house isn't haunted in any conventional sense. It's inhabited by something that exists in the spaces between reality and technology. Something that feeds on observation and grows stronger with every electronic eye we give it to see through. The scratches on the basement wall aren't random. They're a signature, a claim of ownership written in a language older than human speech. The bent sensors aren't broken, they're modified, improved by an intelligence that sees our attempts at security as invitations to play a game we don't understand. And the breathing I've been hearing? It's not the sound of a physical intruder hiding in my basement. It's the rhythm of something vast and patient, slowly synchronizing itself with my own life force, learning to match my patterns, to mirror my existence, until the boundary between observer and observed disappears entirely. My phone buzzes in my hand. 3:47 a.m. motion detected in the basement. This time, I'm not going down. This time, I'm leaving the house to whatever has claimed it, taking nothing but my keys and the terrible knowledge that some doors, once opened, can never be closed again. The breathing starts again through my phone's speaker, mechanical, precise. And now, underneath it, something new, the slow, deliberate sound of footsteps climbing wooden stairs, climbing toward the main floor, climbing toward me. I think it's finally ready to meet its new housemate, face to face. But it had felt like hours. Every shadow seemed to pulse with potential movement. Every creak and groan of the old house made me whirl toward empty corners, gun raised and heart pounding. When I finally retreated upstairs, I locked the basement door and shoved a chair under the handle, as if thin wood and cheap hardware could keep out whatever was staking its claim in the space below. By the fourth night, I'd made a decision that felt either brilliantly courageous or utterly insane. I was going to stay awake and wait. I settled in the kitchen with a clear view of the basement door, my gun within easy reach and my phone set to record everything. If something was living in my basement, if some intruder had found a way in that I couldn't detect, I was determined to catch them in the act. The hours crawled by with agonizing slowness. I drank enough coffee to make my hands shake independently of fear, and I checked the basement camera feed so many times that my phone's battery began to drain. But as 3 a.m. approached, my nerves stretched tight like a snapped wire. The house seemed to grow heavier, more oppressive with every passing minute. Shadows deepening, silence swelling with unspoken threats. Then, at 3:37 a.m., the alarm screamed. This time I was ready. I flipped immediately to the camera feed, heart hammering but mind sharp with caffeine and adrenaline. The basement appeared empty as always, shrouded in that same light-swallowing darkness. But then I saw it: movement. Not random flickers of shadow or shifting light, but deliberate, purposeful motion, as if the absence of light itself was alive, aware. The breathing started soft but grew louder with every cycle, and beneath it came new sounds. Wet, organic noises that spoke of things that shouldn't exist, dragging themselves across cold concrete. Then I saw the sensor begin to bend. The plastic housing curved inward before my eyes, reshaping as if invisible hands were molding it like clay. The movement was slow, deliberate, almost sensual in its precision. When it was done, the sensor was pointed directly at the camera. Directly at me. Then came the impossible. I heard my own breathing through the phone speaker. Not the mechanical, measured sound that had terrified me these past 3 nights, but my own rapid, panicked respirations, transmitted somehow from my position in the kitchen, down to the basement, and back through the camera's microphone. It made no sense. Technically impossible. Improbable. Yet I was listening to myself breathe through a speaker, sitting 30 feet above the device capturing the sound. The realization hit me like a physical blow. Whatever was in my basement wasn't just aware of the cameras and sensors, it was using them. It had learned to manipulate the devices, bending them to its will, turning my security system into a two-way mirror. I hadn't been monitoring an intruder. I had been observed, studied, cataloged by something that understood technology better than I did. I ran, abandoning my post in the kitchen, fleeing to my bedroom like a child afraid of monsters in the dark. But even behind a locked door, I felt exposed, vulnerable, watched by eyes I couldn't see, through cameras I'd installed to make myself feel safe. The basement alarm continued screaming for another 10 minutes before falling silent, leaving me alone with the terrible knowledge. I was no longer the sole occupant of my grandmother's house. Now, as I sit here in the pre-dawn darkness of the 5th night, I finally understand what my grandmother's stories were trying to tell me. This house isn't haunted in any conventional sense. It's inhabited by something that exists in the spaces between reality and technology. Something that feeds on observation and grows stronger with every electronic eye we give it to see through. The scratches on the basement wall aren't random. They're a signature, a claim of ownership written in a language older than human speech. The bent sensors aren't broken, they're modified, improved by an intelligence that sees our attempts at security as invitations to play a game we don't understand. And the breathing I've been hearing? It's not the sound of a physical intruder hiding in my basement. It's the rhythm of something vast and patient, slowly synchronizing itself with my own life force, learning to match my patterns, to mirror my existence, until the boundary between observer and observed disappears entirely. My phone buzzes in my hand. 3:47 a.m. motion detected in the basement. This time, I'm not going down. This time, I'm leaving the house to whatever has claimed it, taking nothing but my keys and the terrible knowledge that some doors, once opened, can never be closed again. The breathing starts again through my phone's speaker, mechanical, precise. And now, underneath it, something new, The slow, deliberate sound of footsteps climbing wooden stairs, climbing toward the main floor, climbing toward me. I think it's finally ready to meet its new housemate, face to face.